Enforcement. How can governments enforce their regulations and penalize the grey market?
Welcome, everyone. If you're joining us from out of town, I hope you're not spending all of your per diem on shirts, even if they are your exact style. We've got a great panel ahead of us. Let's meet the participants. So here's Vadimas to my left, Vadimas Bondarenka. He's a corporate lawyer focusing on the gaming and crypto spaces. He knows the gambling field both from the inside as a compliance officer at BetGames and outside as a lawyer in private practice. Vadimas is with 100x Partners, which focuses on funding and co-investing in the crypto space. Next to Vadimas, we have Jeff Ifrah. He's a long-standing member of the U.S. Gaming Bar. He's a founding member of Ifrah Law. He also founded the iDevelopment and Economic Association, and on behalf of IDEA, he had an integral role in the U.S. case that paved the way for sports betting in the United States. Jeff's practice focuses on gaming, cryptocurrency, and esports. The man that needs no introduction, I'll introduce him anyway. Michael Lipton, he's a senior partner at Dickinson, Wright in Toronto. In Canada, and nobody has more experience and has covered a more diverse range of topics than Michael. And just personally, if I had a gaming law related issue, I would hire Michael and Kevin Weber just behind you there at Dickinson Wright. My name is Jack Tadman. I'm a Toronto-based gaming lawyer. I act for operators, suppliers, affiliates, skill games providers, DFS operators. You can find out more information about my practice and see a very old picture of me at Gamblinglaw.ca. And I'm the only member of the International Masters of Gaming Law and the International Flipper Pinball Association. Topic of today's panel, enforcement. How can governments enforce their regulations and penalize the gray market? So it's a great question. Michael was touching on it in the last panel. It's one that the iGaming industry really has been dealing with since its inception. So, the early days of iGaming were focused on understanding, where does an activity actually take place if it takes place on the internet? If a bet is offered in Antigua and it's accepted in the US, where does that take place? In those days, we heard iGaming often described as the Wild West. Over time, some jurisdictions like the United States have found ways to stop unauthorized gaming. Other jurisdictions like Canada have taken more of a hands-off approach. Europe has tried a bunch of different approaches. And in certain European and US jurisdictions, now in Ontario, jurisdictions are explicitly regulating iGaming happening within their borders. So we're now 25 years out from the first iGaming sites. We have some more information. We know that according to the US, if a bet is accepted in the United States, it takes place in the United States. We know that the early aggressive approach the United States has taken was successful. We've seen European markets address the gray market, and recently Ontario has decided to regulate gaming and has taken a unique approach to stopping the gray market. Okay, that's most of the talking that I'm going to be doing. In the gaming industry, we talk about the gray market all the time, and we talk about it like it is something that definitely exists. So my question for our panelists, first question, is what does the term gray market even mean in the gambling context? We'll start with you, Vadimas. Is it just a construct that gaming companies and lawyers made up just to allow gaming companies to operate in jurisdictions, or is there something more to it?
Well, as we learned in university, the gray market is the thing which is not prohibited is allowed. The simple thing. But actually, to speak in the gaming industry, so actually, that's I would say that I could see it as the opportunity for, let's say, the newcomers. The gray market opportunity for the entities who are just young, let's say, who just started to go into the gray market where they can operate, and let's say to see if they are able to go further, for example, to the bigger, let's say, regulated markets. So I don't know, I would call the gray market, for the startups as the opportunity, let's say.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So Michael, what's your perspective? Does the gray market really exist, or did we just kind of make it up?
I think everybody hear me okay? Good. I think it's an ambiguous term. There is clear law in Canada that prohibits offshore operators from, shall we say, offering their services in terms of iGaming to Canadians. The question is there jurisdiction that extends to these offshore operators? And there's case law that suggests that maybe there is jurisdiction, and if there is, then what the offshore operators are doing is not legal. But as I mentioned in the earlier panel, there are no cases to that effect. And the result is then when there is a lack of cases, lawyers are driven to the point of trying to interpret what the law may be. We don't make the law, we can try to interpret it, but it's up to the court to interpret it properly and to make it. The upshot of that is that I think that the market is relatively clear, and it comes down to the question of risk. Are you prepared to accept the risk? To my way of thinking, if you have issues with respect to being subject to that, you should have no servers in Canada, no assets in Canada, no infrastructure in Canada, so that you can make the strong argument that there's no real and substantial connection to Canada, and therefore perhaps you are outside of the jurisdiction of Canada. That would make you, I think, perhaps in the gray market, because I don't think it's necessarily black or necessarily white. Hope that helps you.
Thanks. Yeah, that was classic lawyer answer, but definitely some good information. Jeff, I mean, you've been in this industry for a really long time. You've seen definitely some shifting sands in the U.S. with respect to operators being allowed to be there, and then some legislation passed, and then of course Black Friday, not called it's not called Gray Friday. So just from your perspective, I mean, how has the U.S. sort of changed over time, and how has your perception of the gray market and what it is changed over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what Michael said applies in the U.S. Obviously, the U.S. has taken a position that even if you have no servers, no infrastructure, nothing, they can still come after you. But what are they coming after? They're really coming after money. They're coming after bank accounts. They're coming after money that's flowing through the country. And they're doing that because it's really a money grab. That's what those cases are all about. Today, when we talk about the gray market, what we're more concerned about are whether consumers understand the difference between playing on a legal site that's regulated by a state regulator and playing on a site that's regulated somewhere else. So when we talk about gray market from a consumer perspective, we're really saying, hey, if you're a consumer and you deposit money and you can't get that money off the account, or you feel like there's been something done that's unfair, where are you going to go? If there's a state regulator you can go to, that's a legal site. If there isn't, that's probably a gray site. And consumers don't understand this. And to me, that's really the biggest problem. I think it's a game of whack-a-mole from a law enforcement perspective. I don't think law enforcement can really dedicate resources to taking down gray markets. I think what we really need to do is have operators invest in educating consumers about the difference between what's a regulated site that will handle a concern, a dispute that focuses on consumer protection, and what isn't. Every day I get questions from people who email me, literally every day. I've lost money on this site. I can't do this. I can't do that. Someone's screwing me. And I'm like, okay, what site? I don't know why they write to me, by the way, but I try to help. And 10 times out of 10, not 9 out of 10, it's some site that is, somewhere in the Caribbean, Antigua, Curacao, whatever. And these, unfortunately, you have to explain to these folks that, they're really out of luck because there's not a lot they can do. Those sites aren't really concerned about bad press. They're not concerned about chat rooms. They're not concerned about being outed on social media. Right. So it's a big problem, but there's a lot that needs to be done in this space to educate consumers about the difference, between regulated and why that's a meaningful thing for them to look into.
Yeah, okay, that's great. So, I mean, got some clarity there. You have your regulated markets, and then a gray market is essentially, when a site is regulated in a different jurisdiction. But I don't think anybody would say that the United States is a gray market. Generally, that's sort of thought of as a black market. Vadimas, I'd like to turn to you here because you were acting as a compliance officer, and your job is to, I'm assuming, decide which jurisdictions it's okay to operate in. So if you could tell us a little bit about the process and how you decided, we can't operate here, this is not allowed, this is allowed. I think that would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, so from the I would tell a little from more maybe from the European perspective how, let's say, because the thing is, yeah, like in Europe there are one market, but let's say countries have, let's say, the different also regulations on that. And that's sometimes the issue for the operators and also the B2B suppliers to go into the market. And how they decided is just you are checking, let's say, are your provided, let's say, games or let's say your service is applied to the rules which are, let's say, written, in certain country regulations. So I don't know. I can give also for the gents like a very good example from the regulatory perspective how the country, let's say, could avoid all those gray incomers who want to enter into the market. For example, the Netherlands, they just opened also their market not so long ago. And the thing is, they were kind of strict about, and at the beginning they told, like the regulator, that they are planning to open. But come on, guys, if you are now operating into, let's say, gray market, as they define themselves, as a gray market, you're going to be, let's say, abandoned for 48 or 33 months, something like that, to enter to the Dutch market. So some of, let's say, let's say, service providers, B2B suppliers, and they stopped at that time, and now they were waiting, when the Dutch market is going to open and they can apply for the license over there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, definitely, as jurisdictions regulate, they have leverage that they wouldn't normally have in terms of being able to stop the gaming that's taking place in their borders. And I would like to get to that, but I mean, before I do that, I want to talk about what jurisdictions can do before that, when they're not mature or regulated markets like we have in the rest of Canada outside of Ontario. So really, how can and how do governments prevent unauthorized internet gaming from occurring in their borders? So I think a good place to go first here would be to Jeff. And the U.S. is considered, again, the least friendly jurisdiction for gray market gaming. I mean, you can get a lawyer to write pretty much anything, but I think you would have a tough time finding one to write that the U.S. is a gray market that you can operate in. So, what are some of the things that the U.S. has done? And I know a lot of these things were done a while ago that really set the tone for the future.
Well, I mean, the United States also has a very strong, stay off the internet policy. I mean, it's not Iran. They're not going to block, other companies from offshore from having access to citizens in a particular state. And that's a big problem. Right now, if you go onto Google, there's no restriction on Google when you put in, where can I bet? I'm in Indiana. What's a legal place to bet? You're not going to necessarily even get regulated sports books in Indiana. You're going to get books that use the term license as an SEO way of getting hits. And they've been on Google longer than the regulated sites. So chances are the top 10 hits you're going to get are all going to be on regulated sites. What can law enforcement do about that? Not a lot. Google could enforce that, but Google doesn't want to enforce that. They don't get involved in organic search results. They get involved in, they might put DraftKings higher if DraftKings pays them, but they're not going to push down MyBookie and BetOnline lower just because they're not paying them. And so there's a lot of private industries that don't regulate this. They allow these entities to continue to advertise, and as a result, they're going to continue to get results. They're going to continue to be in front of customers, and there's not a lot that a regulator can do. They can grab assets if they have them, but they don't keep them here. With the advent of crypto, it's made things even harder because there isn't a necessity for payment processing to go through the United States anymore. And crypto accounts, although they are traceable, there aren't the assets from law enforcement dedicated to tracing those assets. So what you've seen a lot of crypto very heavy now in the offshore sites because of that. So, unfortunately, to answer your question, there really isn't a lot that law enforcement or a regulator can really do. I think it really falls on the operators working with Google and social media sites, because those are the sites that raise the awareness of the existence of those sites. Without Google, without Twitter, without all of those different advertising platforms, those sites wouldn't have a voice. And we need to take away that voice and not look to law enforcement to do that.
Right, and in the past, I mean, the U.S. has been aggressive in terms of, prosecutions, maybe 10, 15 years ago, and I do think that set the stage. In Canada, we've had a much more hands-off approach.
Well, yes and no. The province of Quebec, about 3 years ago, introduced some legislation to try to block offshore iGaming sites. That legislation was declared unconstitutional because it was not within the provincial jurisdiction. It was within the federal jurisdiction relating to telecommunications. But the essence of that legislation was very clearly, political will says we're going to block offshore sites. The lesson learned from Quebec was that you don't have the jurisdiction to do that. Going further west, on the other hand, British Columbia, about 6 years ago, started to send out letters to various regulators of companies that were taking bets from British Columbia. And the British Columbia regulator effectively said to the regulator offshore, look, your registrant is violating British Columbia law. The fact that it is doing that represents that it's lacking in integrity and honesty, and regulator, you should take steps to stop your registrant from doing that.
Did it work?
Ho-hum, that didn't work either. So you then have a situation where the regulator in British Columbia, the government in Quebec has been pushed back. So what can governments, what can law enforcement authorities do? This has been a situation that's been going on since about 2001, because iGaming has been around at least for that period of time and even sooner. But here are some of the things that are the tools that are available. I think a regulator, if it has the political will, can have a name and shame campaign. In this essence, you can publish those licensees who are registered and saying anybody who is not amongst that list, do not do business with, because they are not legal in Canada or they are not legal in Ontario. Indeed, they can even publish the names of those that are unlicensed. So you can have a name and shame campaign. Will it work? We'll see. Second of all, you can reach out to the third-party providers, payment providers, for example, and say to these payment providers, you are supporting an activity that is illegal in this province. And if you do that, you are at risk of prosecution. And there are some provinces that have very strict gaming laws in relation to conduct and management. So you can reach out to regulators, you can reach out to third parties, you can also do a name and shame campaign. The question is, what about a prosecution against an offshore regulator? There has been prosecutions in Canada of land people who have their servers in Canada, but there's never been a prosecution of an offshore internet gaming operator. Will that ever occur? I've got some concerns and doubts about it, because I don't think that we're ready to jump into that particular area. I think prosecution is going to be very expensive. There's bigger fish to fry and what have you. So unfortunately, that's the situation that we're in, and we got to make the best of it. I heard about some other jurisdictions, for example, on day one, the Netherlands or Denmark started to fine people or seek to impose fines against operators who were not licensed.
Yeah, that's something I think Vadimas was touching on that. Once
that's a hell of a way to get everybody's attention.
Absolutely. Once jurisdictions actually regulate, then they have additional tools at their disposal. And I'd like to talk about disposal. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. So Vadimas, you mentioned the Netherlands. If you want to expand on that, I mean, that would be amazing. There's been some creative approaches taken. Any other European approaches would be great too.
I just can a little bit refer to what Michael just told about the blocking the payment and ongoing prosecutions. There also was the situation that you mentioned, that it's kind of, could be an effective and costly, if I understood correctly. So actually, the Norway was doing it. There was some, let's say, also operators, let's say the people who are betting over there, the users, and then the payment provider started to block it, and let's say the prosecution was going on also in Norway, and they just stated, let's say, very clear that those payment, let's say, providers should have to block, all the payments which are coming out of the operators, and yeah, they couldn't go nowhere else. They have just to follow the rules, of the court.
Was that effective? So it sounds like they made some progress there.
Well, let's say, you always find a way how to move, along. At least,
Life
sure.
finds a way. It's like
there is always the way,
Jurassic
yeah.
Park.
So, of course, some of the blocking parts, it affected, but of course, you cannot stop it, for 100%.
Got it. So Jeff, bad actor clauses, are they sort of within a lot of the legislation as the states regulate, or have they disappeared?
So bad actor clauses are actually unconstitutional. Nevada and
Probably
California. Well, that doesn't mean the regulators won't try. Bad actor clauses are unconstitutional for a variety of legal reasons, but I don't want you to call me a nerd when I'm done speaking, so I'm not going to go into that. But Nevada still has one on the books. California, of course, there's no legal online betting there, but they may reintroduce the bad actor clause when they do. They had one in their poker bill about 10 years ago. So like Michael said, online gaming and betting has been around since 2000, like you said, even before, and there's always been a lobby to try and get these states to introduce bills. And California and Nevada did both of those things. The bad actor clause is really because of poker stars, and they really wanted to stop them from being able to participate in the market. So it's kind of the opposite of what you were saying. You were talking about, Vadim was saying, well, maybe, when there's a new law, you tell people to take a timeout, and then they can come back, and that encourages the unregulated folks to leave the market. This was a totally different approach. This was not, you're never going to come into the market, and that's actually an approach that has been shown not to work, because that doesn't really inspire anyone to leave. It just basically inspires everyone to hang out and make as much as you can until the ceiling falls down.
Right. So that's, I think, a great...
No, I also wanted to reflect that that's what, operators, let's say, discussing between themselves, and also in different panels, that, let's say, if there is possibility, to operate somewhere, and let's say, until you will not get fined, or
Right.
something, just they're doing it, That's not, of course, from the regulatory perspective, that's not correct, but this is what they're doing. They're operating, and then they see, it's better to operate than not to operate.
Right. That's why I want to turn to Michael here for the rest of our time and talk a little bit about Ontario, because Ontario's taken a business-focused approach with respect to previous gray market activities. And let's use the last few minutes. If you could just talk about the Ontario approach and
Sure.
how they're bringing gray market operators into the fold.
I think Ontario has taken a very progressive approach, and that is it wants to regulate the market. And that means, how do you best regulate the market? You attract as many different operators from different jurisdictions that you can, because the larger the scale that you have, then the more buy-in that you will have. And so what Ontario determined to do was not to in any way disqualify any operator that was taking bets from Ontario before the market went live. It effectively said it wants to create an equal playing field. It will not disqualify anybody if that person was offside insofar as Ontario or Canada is concerned. And as a result, it sort of opened the doors very, very much so, and welcomed those operators to the point where it now has, I think, 16 operators, and it has a number of them in the pipeline as well. And I think that's the best approach possible, because effectively you are seeking to induce these operators to come on side, to recognize that this is a brave new world, and to make sure that you're in the position at the same time of protecting the public. Ontario has also, as you may have heard at this particular session or an earlier one, or in another gaming summit, has sought to try to work with operators, potential operators and suppliers, and to help them every inch of the way. It's a long journey to become licensed in Ontario, and there's a number of specifications, requirements, and stipulations, and Ontario has opened the door, so to speak, and effectively has people with the AGCO and with IGO seeking to help the operators cross every bridge, ensure that they are understanding of what the requirements are to make sure that it's as welcoming as possible and to bring them into the fold. And as a result, I think this is going to be a very successful market.
Okay, thanks, Michael. That was great. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Thank you, panelists. If you have any questions, any follow-up, I mean, just come find us. We're all very approachable, and we're happy to answer any questions that you have. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.